Please allow me to introduce our next speaker, C. John Collins. Dr. Collins is professor of Old Testament at Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. Dr. Collins served as Old Testament chair on the translation committee for the English Standard Version of the Bible and Old Testament editor for the ESV Study Bible. He has written extensively on biblical languages and interpretation and on science and the Christian faith, including Did Adam and Eve Really Exist? Who they were and why you should care. The God of Miracles, an exegetical examination of God's action in the world, Science and Faith, Friends or Foes, and Genesis, chapters 1 through 4, a linguistic, literary, and theological commentary. Join me as we listen in to Dr. Collins' presentation.
So thank you. It is really a pleasure, a privilege, and honor to be here with you. A little bit about my background. I was a student at MIT back in the 1970s, received a bachelor's and master's there in computer sciences and systems engineering. And Dr. Amadi, who's in the back there, was my roommate when I was a graduate student. And then sometime later, I did my PhD work at the University of Liverpool in England in the School of Archaeology, Classics, and Egyptology, so Ancient Near Eastern Studies. And that's a picture of my doctoral advisor with a cuneiform tablet in his hand, who recently passed away, whose passing I lament intensely. Now, I have a very positive view of the sciences, and I think that it's more than simply satisfying curiosity, that it's also good guidance for how to conduct oneself. That is my hand that you see on the left side there, and that is a Mexican red-kneed spider, tarantula spider as a matter of fact, and that's at a museum in Oxford, England, and then you can see there's my wife also with the spider on her elbow. You can see the kind of personality that it takes to remain married to me for 45 years. And in the background there is a fellow Bible scholar, John Walton, and you see he's not getting anywhere near what he thinks is the danger zone, but you see, if you know a little bit of science, you know that that's not a danger zone. You know that a tarantula is not a threat for the most part to human life. I respect it, but I don't fear it. And I think that's a general disposition that I encourage, and something that knowing something about the world that God made will help you immensely. Now, you might think that that's a picture of my study and my desk. That's actually the study of Alan Guth, but mine could look just like this, and so I have a great admiration for people whose workspaces look just like that. And my friend Samwise is the one who helps me sort everything out and get to clarity. He's my research assistant, so George mentioned him earlier. Now, it was back in August of 1989 that John Maddox, who was then the editor of the journal Nature, wrote his column, Down with the Big Bang. He found the theory to be what he called philosophically unacceptable, because it leaves us with no answer to what caused the Big Bang itself. He allows that creationists and those of similar persuasion seeking support for their opinions have ample justification in the doctrine of the Big Bang. Now, he calls these people moderate creationists, and he contrasts them with what he says, what he calls their more impatient and noisy brethren, who seem more concerned to demonstrate that the whole world began just a few thousand years ago. Now, in the same editorial, Maddox asserts his loyalty to the philosophical position called positivism. He says reality is what you can measure, and what you cannot measure does not count. So I expect that he didn't sympathize even with the moderate creationists. Now, at any rate, he ends his piece with optimism that the soon-to-be-launched Hubble telescope in 1990 would undercut any credibility for such theories as this Big Bang stuff. It will be a surprise, he says, if the Big Bang theory somehow survives the Hubble telescope. Well, Maddox was wrong about the Hubble, but we're here to talk about the successor to that, namely the James Webb Space Telescope, which has now been sending photos for about 2 years. Now, others can and have done to talk about the specific conclusions that we may draw from this new and marvelous device. It would be foolish of me to waste any of your time on my take on that. Rather, my charge is to say something about the theological side of things. For 3 millennia, faithful people have been singing that the heavens declare the glory of God and the sky above proclaims his handiwork, from Psalm 19. If we still sing this, can we sing it with the confidence that comes from intellectual integrity? I'll argue that we can and we should have such confidence. So I'll begin by briefly reviewing the biblical passages that speak of the creation's testimony to its creator. It's important for us to appreciate that some scholars think that the Bible itself leads us to expect that the creation's testimony doesn't amount to very much. Others will note that since the Bible's not a science textbook, we can't use the sciences very much in discerning that testimony. Now, I do accept that these scholars have made some valid points, but I don't think that their valid points establish their reservations. In the Hebrew Bible, we have these familiar passages from the Psalms, which we can supplement with a text from the prophet Isaiah. In Psalm 8, when I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've set in place, what is man that you care for him, and the son of man what is man that you're mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? For you've made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. Or Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There's no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Psalm 147, I think all of these passages have been mentioned in the course of the day's proceedings. He determines the number of the stars. He gives to all of them their names. Great is our Lord and abundant in power. His understanding is beyond measure. The Lord lifts up the humble. He casts the wicked to the ground. And then from Isaiah chapter 40, to whom then will you liken God, or what likeness compare with him? From verse 18, verse 26, lift up your eyes on high and see who created these. He who brings out the host by number, calling them all by name, by the greatness of his might, and because he is strong in power, not one is missing. All of these take some kind of testimony from the world around us in order to strengthen the faithful in their trust toward God, especially as to the greatness of the God who made all this, which means that he can surely achieve his purposes and care for his people, and also that mankind, and particularly his people, have a marvelously privileged place in all of creation. Derek Kidner put it so wonderfully this way. From his side, God shows in Isaiah 40, verse 26 and following, that the right inference from his ordered heavens is not his remoteness, but his eye for detail. How lovely is that? But of course, these passages are addressed to people who already have some kind of belief in God. Perhaps the world doesn't say anything to unbelievers, somebody might suggest and has suggested. Now, Jews living in the Greek-speaking world before the time of Jesus actually addressed this. But for the sake of time, I'll skip to the Christian apostle Paul, who was a well-educated and Greek-speaking Jew. And in his letter to the Roman Christians in chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, he says these familiar words, "For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived from the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." Now, as it turns out, Greek thinkers had also been coming to see that there must be a supreme God behind the world. And here Paul is explicitly affirming what these thinkers have seen, as well as taking it further. The eternal power and divine nature of the supreme God, which are invisible, are made visible by the very nature of the world as a creation. There's no excuse for not seeing that. Now, mind you, Paul was aware, as any of us are, that receiving the testimony is not automatic. People can suppress the truth, as he says. And C.S. Lewis commented about Uncle Andrew in The Magician's Nephew, when Andrew wasn't moved like all the other newly made creatures were at Aslan's work of creation. Lewis, the narrator, says, "For what you see and hear depends a good deal on where you are standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are." Now, for our topic, the space philosopher Frank White coined the term overview effect for the feeling of awe that astronauts often experience in spaceflight. And he notes that Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the moon on Apollo 14 in 1971, insisted, he says, that everyone who went to the moon actually had the same experience of the overview effect. But then it was processed and interpreted through individual worldviews, individual histories. That is to say, the reasons to believe are there, but sometimes the reasoners need to be helped to attend to those reasons, which is what you all try to do. But the key here is you're not manufacturing the testimony. So what is the place of the sciences in our helping people to see and to respond to the world's testimony? It's a legitimate question. After all, the perceptions described in the Psalms and Isaiah are mostly intuitive, speaking to the hearts of agricultural peasants. People who do have brains, to be sure, but who don't have the leisure time that it takes to develop what we think of as the sciences. Besides, according to Judge William Overton, who presided at the Arkansas creation law trial in 1982, the conclusions of true science must be, he says, tentative, not necessarily the final word. Well, these are fair cautions, I suppose, but they're not the end of the matter. After all, if intuitive perceptions have any truth to them, we would expect that applying intellectually rigorous critique would support and perhaps refine them. And that's just what the Greek and Jewish thinkers were doing in their own way. A process of refinement visible in the letter to the Romans to those who are willing to see it. Indeed, that's what the sciences are supposed to be at their best. Besides, not all scientific conclusions are at the same level of tentativity. Some have been well tested and seem worthy of what can be called a proper confidence. I don't have time to describe how the tools supplied by systems engineering have helped me. I discuss some of this in my book, Reading Genesis Well, but oftentimes contrasting positions are put on a spectrum of one dimension, say in politics or whatever, from the far left to the far right, whereas a multi-dimensional system would be far more informative, but I can talk to you about that later. Let me illustrate my point rather from a subject that Fuz Rana has written on, namely how to think about unborn humans. The biblical passages that pro-lifers like myself have gone to, such as Psalm 139 or Luke chapter 1, certainly trace God's personal care of the faithful to their time in their mother's wombs. At the same time, some think these texts aren't decisive as to just when the embryo became a person. Here's where fetology can help us. Now, I had a conversation with ChatGPT a while ago in which I asked it. My leading question was, what happens in an abortion? And then I further asked it, what is a human fetus? And when does a human embryo become human? So when I asked it, when does a human embryo become human, it came back with some wishy-washy stuff about the debatable judgments people make about when personhood begins. Now, fortunately, I had read Robert Spamann's valuable book, Persons, where he notes that personhood, if we start looking for qualifications for personhood, we're just going to get into difficulties that we don't need to have. And because of that, I kept pressing ChatGPT. And after a lot of back and forth with it, I came back with this. I conclude that if we let the biological science be our guide, we can use membership in the human species as our criterion for a life to protect. Personhood seems to be an amorphous notion anyhow. ChatGPT still waffled when I wrote that, and so I came back to it with this. You keep saying that the issue is complex. What makes it complex is not the science, but the varying notions of personhood and the differing value systems, or so it seems to me. The science seems like a good tool in a pluralistic culture. And so the machine finally admitted this. You're absolutely correct, and I apologize if the repeated emphasis on complexity gave the impression that the science itself is complex. Indeed, the biological aspect of when human life begins, from a scientific standpoint, is relatively straightforward. Human life begins at conception. The complexity arises from the varying notions of personhood and the differing value systems and ethical perspectives held by individuals and societies. All right. So the term settled science can be a way of weaseling out of a critical discussion. That's true, but the deliverances of theology on this topic seem about as secure as any empirically based conclusion can be. So the science has not only supported the intuition, it has clarified that the beginning of life goes right the way back to fertilization. I'm glad to share the whole transcript of my conversation with you if you want it. But it does more. Much of the current rhetoric about the subject insists on bodily autonomy as the chief ethical factor, which trumps all other considerations. But the theology shows us that the truth about us is that we're all interconnected. Indeed, we are interdependent, as the Bible had already shown us. We have rights, sure, but we also have responsibilities to the other. The current ethical rhetoric that we're exposed to is wildly out of step with the best science and therefore out of touch with reality. Thank you, science, is my response. So now let's come back to cosmology. Estimates of how many stars an ancient person in the Mediterranean world would have seen with the naked eye make the number fewer than, let's just say, 10,000. Hubble and now James Webb have increased that number by orders of magnitude. Now, mind you, as C.S. Lewis pointed out in talking about the medievals and their conception of how large the universe was, now, of course, this is a small distance compared with those of which modern astronomers talk, but we are here considering not the accuracy of the figure, but its imaginative and emotional impact. So in any event, far from undermining the intuitive wonder expressed in the Psalms, the telescopes have amplified it. And by the same token, the notion of cosmic fine-tuning has added to the intuition about how well-suited the world and we are for each other, and has furthered the more philosophical or scientific argument from design, taking it even further from one of the best exemplars of it, namely that which the church father Athanasius had done so effectively in his work on the Incarnation, but that's back in the 4th century. But as well as I think these findings, I think these findings do a little more than what Lewis allowed. I wouldn't dare disagree with C.S. Lewis in public, but I'm gilding the lily, all right? So a little bit more than this. Yes, the ancients realized that the cosmos is vast, but now we see that this is an understatement. It is unimaginably vast and filled with unimaginably numerous objects. The God who made all this, who rules this, and in all of that cares particularly for me and for each one of us, must be unimaginably vast in power and mind as well. Now, our theology had taught us that, it's true, but just in case we hadn't stretched our imaginations far enough, we can now see how much farther we have to stretch them. Well, okay, you might say, but what about the Big Bang? So I'll save a few remarks about that for my final point. You don't need to spend much energy on internet searches to find people confidently issuing the obituary for the Big Bang cosmological theories. Generally speaking, these writers fall into two broad categories: young Earth creationists on the one hand, and those who oppose the idea of an uncaused beginning on the other. I won't rehearse and assess their arguments here, since others are better equipped to do so, but the claim is out there that the data from the James Webb scope is challenging the Big Bang models in cosmology. Now, my place to start would be to clarify just what we mean by the words data and challenge, and I invoke St. Inigo Montoya here, as often I do. You keep using that word, but I do not think it means what you think it means. So, and particularly the words data and challenge. We're still in the early days for the James Webb data, as Hugh has already stressed, and much of the initial hoopla was based on even earlier results than that, which hadn't been thoroughly reviewed. In that case, if it's data, well, it's raw and drastically incomplete, which is never a sound basis for far-reaching assertions. Fortunately, it seems that the more reasonable conclusion is that the Big Bang theory being actually a family of models, the data are helping to refine these models and perhaps to commend some models over others. As an author in Science News in March of this year put it, his headline was, "Did the James Webb Telescope break the universe? Maybe not." And he says, astronomers are still figuring out how to interpret what JWST is telling them. If I may borrow from Mark Twain, the report of the death of the Big Bang was an exaggeration. And so that reminds us that the word challenge doesn't mean the same thing as refutation. Challenge is really more of an opportunity or a call to reflect further, which is what Hugh was talking about just a few minutes ago. So we can keep our bearings and help others to do so. In fact, the haste in dismissing the Big Bang is often the product of what is called motivated reasoning. The reasoner wants to protect a cherished view. Now, John Maddox was explicit about this. He did not want a beginning for the universe whose cause was outside the web of material cause and effect. Sir Arthur Eddington declared, back in 1931, commenting on the new theories posited by Georges Lemaitre, which became what we know of as the Big Bang cosmology, he said, "Philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order of nature is repugnant to me." But in that same context, he was honest enough to admit that the current science really does present us with one, while wondering, or perhaps hoping, that future science will, as he said, find an escape. And our young earth creationist friends are keen to protect their reading of Genesis, which is connected to a number of other items, such as how they handle the problem of evil. Now, mind you, we should be forthright about our own motivations in reasoning. Because as a Christian, I affirm creation from nothing. I like the Big Bang models and the kinds of conclusions people tend to draw from them. But as a Christian, I'm also committed to intellectual rigor and ruthless honesty. The Christian philosopher Doug Groothuis has a very nice post about that on the Worldview Bulletin site. And there he argues, in talking about intellectual integrity, he argues that Christians ought to be committed to what he calls intellectual integrity. And he says one has intellectual integrity if one's beliefs are well-formed, coherent, well-founded, providing knowledge, and form a unified whole that accounts for and explains reality. Those with intellectual integrity shun holding contradictory beliefs. They do not fear acquiring new knowledge that might discredit previous beliefs, and they are intellectually studious about what matters. People have raised questions both in the previous panel and also at lunchtime. How do we get people in our churches to be willing to talk about these things? Well, I suppose what we really need to be doing is talking up this virtue of intellectual integrity and challenging people. This is what it means to be a faithful Christian. This is what it means to trust the God who made the world and made us to live in the world. So the question, therefore, is not whether we have prior beliefs and preferences, but whether we're willing to expose them to review and even to revision. Christians should commit themselves to this kind of integrity. Jews and Christians formulated the doctrine of creation from nothing based on their reading of Genesis, especially of Genesis 1 and verse 1. And they did so at a time when the leading scientific and philosophical minds held that the universe had no beginning. Since these Christians held science in high regard, they found ways to manage the discrepancy. But no one doubts that the theories from the 20th century take a great load off of us in such management. These theories have held up well under severe critique. We've heard about some of the critiques and people highly motivated to undo these theories, and they've not succeeded, which is good because that's an indicator that these theories are durable. We welcome the critique, and we also welcome what seems to be the well-grounded confidence that, at least as far as the evidence is concerned, the theories aren't anywhere near leaving us. In fact, they're looking stronger every time. And of course, the Big Bang fits in with the various depictions of cosmic fine-tuning. Not only does the universe look like it had a beginning, but it also looks like it is set up for us. Just what Roger was talking about a few minutes ago, about we're sort of off in a quiet corner of the universe, which means that we can survive. And that certainly presses upon us the feeling that maybe we were meant to be here. Now, the universe doesn't answer all of our questions, such as who made it and why, and as well as what's gone wrong and what's anyone going to do about it. But its testimony surely insists that we pay close attention to any source that both affirms its testimony and offers answers to these poignant questions, which is just what the biblical writers do for us. So, how should I conclude? One thing I haven't touched on, I don't know if it's an elephant in the room for you, but it should be. One thing I haven't touched on is the question of the allocation of money and talent needed to make this device, set it up and operate it, the triad of time, talent, and treasure, and so forth. It's a legitimate question, but it's not my topic. So I'm just going to take it for granted, as we all are, that the decision's already been made, and our concerns are what do we make of the findings? Those findings that we've got so far and those that we'll be getting in future. The simple answer is that we welcome them. They give us an opportunity to exercise intellectual discipline and integrity. They call on us to help our fellow humans to think seriously about their own lives and whether there's a God who calls them to know Him and to whom they must give an account. And they amplify the sense of wonder that all the faithful yearn to feel as they contemplate the magnificent universe that God has made. That is to say, these findings serve scientific curiosity, they serve our intellectual integrity, they serve our apologetic purposes, but they also deepen our piety. That the God who made all of this is the God who sent the Lord Jesus and raised Him from the dead and promises to care for each one of us so that we can glorify and enjoy Him now and forever.